Welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm your host.
And I'm glad to be here.
Great to have you. Today, we're getting into something really important. Pennsylvania House Bill 914. You might know it as the Rent Stabilization Act of 2025.
That's right. And it's definitely legislation with some potentially big impacts.
Absolutely. This isn't just, legal jargon. It could genuinely change things for people's daily lives, housing costs, our communities here in Pennsylvania, and definitely in Chester County.
Touches renters, landlords, really anyone concerned about housing affordability.
Exactly. So if you find what we discussed valuable today, please do hit like, share it with someone who might be interested, and subscribe. It helps us keep doing these deep dives.
It really does.
And hey, a big thank you to Tom in Westchester for listening. We see you, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Tom.
And remember, we drop a new deep dive every single Monday.
Okay, so House Bill 914. Let's unpack it. What's the basic idea?
Yeah, what is it at its core?
Well, okay, so it's House Bill 914, part of the current 2025-2026 session in the PA General Assembly. The official goal is to change the Landlord and Tenant Act of 1951.
Change it how?
Specifically, the bill wants to introduce, and I quote, limitations on rent increases. It also aims to impose duties on the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, or PHFA. We'll probably just call it PHFA.
Okay, PHFA. So limitations on rent increases, basically capping rent hikes.
That's the main thrust, yeah. The memo that went around with the bill was titled Stabilizing Rent Prices in Pennsylvania. Pretty clear intention there.
Right. And who's behind it?
The prime sponsor is Representative Jim Prokopiak. He's a Democrat, represents House District 140, and there are several other Democratic co-sponsors listed as well.
And where is it now, process-wise?
As of mid-March 2025, it got referred to the House Committee on Housing and Community Development, so it's in the committee stage.
Gotcha. So, okay, for you listening, maybe you're a renter, maybe a landlord. How would these rent limits actually work? What's the mechanism?
Yeah. Right. The mechanics are pretty detailed. First off, there's something called the annual rent increase allowance.
Okay.
The PHFA's executive director would calculate this each year. And it's set to be the lesser of two things.
Lesser of?
Either the consumer price index for all urban consumers, that's the CPIU figure you hear about, plus 3% of the base rent, or just a flat 6% of the base rent. Whichever number is lower, that's the maximum allowance for that year.
Interesting. So CPIU plus 3% or 6%, the lower one applies?
Exactly. But then there's another layer, an overall cap.
Okay.
No matter what that annual allowance calculation says, a rent increase can never go over 10% of the base rent when a lease is renewed or a new one starts.
So 10% is the absolute ceiling regardless?
Correct. Now, there's also a provision for a banked amount.
Banked amount, what's that?
It means if a landlord doesn't use their full allowed increase in 1 year, they can kind of save up the unused portion, carry it over to potentially use in a future year's increase. Gives them a bit of flexibility.
Ah, okay. Some wiggle room there. But what if, a landlord has genuinely skyrocketing costs? Insurance, big repairs, property taxes going way up. What if that allowed percentage just doesn't cut it?
That's a key question. The bill addresses this through provisions for fair return and capital improvements.
How does that work?
It says landlords can petition a court specifically, a magisterial district court, which are our local courts here in PA, to ask for an increase above that annual allowance.
On what grounds?
Two main reasons. Either they need it to get a fair return on their property investment, or they need it to cover the costs of major capital improvements. Think like a new roof, new plumbing system, things like that.
Magisterial district court. Yeah, it sounds like it could get complicated, maybe bureaucratic. What's your take on the practicality for, say, a smaller landlord?
That's definitely a point critics raise, which we'll get to. But yeah, it involves going to court. And for those capital improvements, there are even more rules.
Like what?
Well, any surcharge added for those improvements would be limited. It has to be prorated, often spread out over many years, like 96 months for building-wide stuff, 60 months for unit-specific things.
So tenants pay it back slowly.
Right. And there are caps on how much the surcharge can be, like 15% or 20% of the base rent. Plus, and this is important, the surcharge only applies after the work is done and the costs are recovered.
Wow.
And the improvements themselves have to genuinely boost health, safety, security, or just the basic habitability of the place. It's not for, cosmetic upgrades.
Okay, that's a lot of hoops to jump through for major repairs.
Yeah.
And what about this PHFA agency you mentioned? What's their big job in all this?
PHFA gets a huge role. They're tasked with creating all the detailed rules and regulations within 90 days of the bill actually becoming law.
90 days? That seems fast.
It is. They need to come up with a clear formula for calculating that fair return we talked about. They need to spell out exactly what landlords need to include in those court petitions, and they have to set up a whole system for processing these requests uniformly across the state.
That sounds like a massive undertaking for a state agency.
It absolutely is. And here's a really critical point for everyone watching this unfold. The parts of the bill dealing with rent increases and exemptions, they cannot actually be enforced until PHFA gets those rules and regulations finalized and published.
So even if the bill passes, there's this built-in delay and uncertainty while PHFA figures out the details.
Precisely. There'd be a period of limbo.
Interesting. Okay, you also mentioned exemptions earlier. Who doesn't this bill apply to? Is it universal rent control?
No, definitely not universal. There's a significant list of exemptions. It seems designed to target larger, older, multi-unit buildings primarily.
So who's out?
Newer construction, for one. Anything less than 23 years old is exempt. Also, lots of specialized housing. Licensed care facilities, nonprofits running temporary shelters, owner-occupied group homes, places owned by religious groups, hotels or transient lodging, school dorms, assisted living, nursing homes.
Okay, a lot of specific categories.
Yeah, and also owner-occupied buildings with just 2 units. Plus, accessory dwelling units, ADUs. Units that already have some kind of government low-income rent agreement.
Right.
Also, units that have been substantially renovated within the last 23 years. And, this is a big one, landlords who own only 2 or fewer rental units total, as long as they're an individual person, a trust, or an estate, not a big corporation.
Wow, okay, so that carves out quite a bit of the market, especially small mom-and-pop landlords and newer buildings.
It really does. It significantly narrows the scope of who is actually covered by these potential rent caps.
Which brings us to the next big question.
Right. While the intention behind HB 914 tackling rising housing costs seems clear and, arguably necessary for many Pennsylvanians, there are critics who argue this specific approach might not actually solve the state's deeper housing crisis.
And this is where the debate really heats up, right?
Yeah.
We've looked at some sources that offer a pretty strong critique, pointing out potential problems, maybe some unintended consequences.
Exactly. The core argument you hear from these critical analyses is this. Pennsylvania's housing affordability problem is fundamentally about supply and demand, not enough houses for the people who need them.
Okay.
And these critics say HB 914 focuses entirely on controlling the price of existing rentals, but does basically nothing to encourage the creation of more housing.
So they see it as treating a symptom, not the underlying cause. Like putting a price control on bread during a famine doesn't actually create more bread.
That's a pretty good analogy for their perspective, yes. Let's dig into their specific concerns. First off, the impact on housing supply.
What's the worry there?
Critics argue there are 0 incentives in this bill for developers to build new rental housing. They often point to historical examples, places like New York City or San Francisco, arguing that rent control policies there led to supply stagnating over time.
How so?
Well, they say landlords might convert rent-controlled apartments into condos or take them off the rental market entirely for owner occupancy, which actually reduces the number of available rental units.
Oh, interesting twist.
And there's another supply-side concern: maintenance. If rents are tightly capped long-term, the argument goes, landlords might have less money or less incentive to keep properties in good repair. So you could see a decline in housing quality over time.
That doesn't sound good for tenants either. What about the direct impact on landlords, especially smaller ones?
That's criticism number 2. Impact on landlords. Critics frame this as an erosion of property rights and a disincentive to invest in rental housing. This hits small and mid-size owners particularly hard, folks who might be operating on tighter margins.
Because the rent caps might not keep up with costs.
Precisely. Those caps, CPIU plus 3%, max 6%, absolute ceiling 10%. They might look reasonable on paper, critics say, but what if operating costs like insurance, property taxes, utilities, or major repairs suddenly jump much faster than that? The caps might not allow landlords to cover those real-world expenses.
And that leads back to the court process you mentioned.
Yes, that requirement to petition a magisterial district court for a fair return or to cover big capital improvements, critics describe that as a potential bureaucratic nightmare.
A nightmare how?
They fear it would be slow, costly, and uncertain. It could delay essential upgrades needed to keep housing safe and decent. And the fear is that this hassle, combined with capped returns, could push smaller landlords to just sell their properties, getting out of the rental business altogether.
Which, again, could shrink the rental supply.
Exactly. It's a potential feedback loop.
Okay, so potential negative impacts on supply, potential negative impacts on landlords. What about the tenants? The very people the bill is supposed to help. Do critics see downsides for them too?
They do. This is criticism 3. Unintended consequences for tenants. One argument is about reduced mobility. If you're in a rent-controlled unit, you might be hesitant to move, even if your job changes, your family grows, or your needs shift, because you won't find a comparable deal elsewhere. This can kind of gum up the works of the housing market, making it harder for everyone to find suitable housing.
Huh. I hadn't thought of that. What else?
There's a concern about discrimination. If landlords can't raise rents adequately, they might become much pickier about who they rent to, perhaps favoring tenants they perceive as lower risk, which could disadvantage some groups. And we touched on this, but the potential for declining unit quality is a big one. If landlords are financially squeezed, needed maintenance might get deferred, leaving tenants living in deteriorating conditions.
Not ideal.
And finally, there's the risk of a shadow market emerging. Maybe under-the-table payments or landlords cutting back on services or amenities to try and make up for lost rental income, which could disproportionately harm lower-income renters.
Okay, that paints a pretty concerning picture of potential downsides. What about the bigger picture? The state agencies, the market itself.
That's the final area, criticism 4. Impact on state agencies and market distortion. Critics worry about PHFA being overloaded.
You mentioned that earlier, the 90-day deadline.
Right. They'd suddenly have all these complex new duties, creating formulas, managing exemptions, reviewing court petitions, setting rules for vacancies, possibly without guaranteed new funding or staff to handle it all. That could lead to bottlenecks and inefficiencies.
And the uncertainty.
That's another big point. Because the rent rules can't kick in until PHFA makes its rules, there'd be this period of regulatory limbo. No one, landlords or tenants, would be quite sure what the rules are for potentially several months.
Creates instability.
Exactly. And zooming out even further, critics warn about market distortion. They fear that enacting this kind of rent control could make Pennsylvania look like a risky place to invest in property compared to other states.
Why risky?
Because investors might worry about unpredictable regulations and capped returns. This could scare away capital investment that's needed to build new housing or maintain existing stock, potentially making the underlying housing shortage even worse in the long run.
So pulling it all together, if these criticisms are valid, if rent control like this isn't the answer according to these sources, what do they suggest? What are the alternatives proposed to tackle the affordable housing crisis?
The alternatives presented in these critical analyses almost all focus on one thing: increasing the supply of housing, rather than controlling the price of existing housing.
Okay, so how do they propose doing that?
Several key strategies come up. One is loosening restrictive zoning laws, things like single-family-only zoning, minimum lot sizes, parking requirements. Critics say these make it harder and more expensive to build diverse types of housing, especially denser, more affordable options.
So allow for more apartments, townhouses, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Another suggestion is to actively incentivize new development. That could mean tax breaks, density bonuses, or other financial tools to encourage builders to create more housing, particularly affordable units.
Makes sense.
Streamlining the permitting process is another big one. Getting approvals to build can often take a very long time and be very complex. Making that faster and more predictable could lower costs and speed up construction.
Less red tape.
Right. Supporting public-private partnerships is also mentioned, collaborations between government and private developers specifically aimed at building affordable housing units. And finally, instead of controlling rents across the board, some suggest providing direct financial assistance, like housing vouchers or subsidies to renters who need help affording market-rate housing.
So help the people directly rather than trying to control the whole market price.
That's the idea behind that approach, yes. Empower individuals with purchasing power in the existing market while simultaneously working to expand the overall supply.
It definitely shifts the focus, doesn't it? From managing scarcity to trying to create more options.
It's a fundamentally different approach to the problem.
So thinking about everything we've discussed, the details of House Bill 914, the potential benefits for tenants needing immediate relief, but also these significant concerns about supply, maintenance, and unintended consequences. It leaves us with a big question, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
How can Pennsylvania, or really any place facing this, effectively balance that immediate, very real need for rent stabilization for struggling residents, with the equally critical long-term need to actually increase the housing supply and foster a market that's healthy and equitable for everyone. What part of this whole complex picture stands out most to you listening right now?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, really.
Indeed. And that brings us to the end of this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us and exploring the complexities of Pennsylvania House Bill 914 with us today.
Thanks for having me. It's a crucial topic.
It really is. Our goal here is always to help you get informed quickly and thoroughly, and we certainly hope we did that. For ongoing coverage of everything happening in Chester County news, events, information, please do check out mychesco.com.
It's a great resource.
And don't forget, we're back with a brand new deep dive every Monday, so make sure you join us next week.
We'll be here.
Thanks again for listening, everyone. We'll catch you on the next one.